Welcome to another episode of Start, Grow and Monetize Your Podcast with me, Alex Chisnall, and him, James Burtt. We are talking how to get PR for your podcast on this very episode, okay? So you might have started your podcast, you might have started growing your podcast, you might have started monetizing your podcast, but have you gone to Pod School, our free community, the number one podcast community in the world, to learn even more and get more accountability and more support abound your podcast. Abound your podcast.
Abound, I like it.
Abound your podcast. So
if you haven't, you're missing out, by the way.
You're massively missing out. It's free. Why wouldn't you want to go there? We talk about things like
how to get PR for your podcast, which is actually shout out to Pod School Pro member Ali, because this was Ali's question in Pod School Pro a couple of weeks ago. So if you want to join us, you can join in the live trainings, etc. But you can also just ask us questions and we'll turn them into podcast episodes for you. Give you a shout out.
How cool is that?
Ali, by the way, big shout out to Ali. She's 20 episodes into launching her podcast now. She's an alumni member of the Pod School community and already launching a book off the back of her podcast after 20 episodes. I've done about 500-600 episodes. No one's ever asked me to release a flipping book. Ali, you talented thing, you. She's also got one of the best voices you've ever heard in your life.
Right.
She's got one of those like proper voiceover voices. She could read you the phone book and you'd happily listen to it. Anyway, Ali asked about securing PR. So one of the key things I think is really imperative to understand at the get-go is PR is still massively, massively, massively valuable. In a world of Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, I was about to say Vine. Is that still a thing? Vine's not a thing, is it? Snapchat and all that stuff. There's different mediums, and because it's become easier for us to self-publish and self-create these days, I think a lot of people think that's the only way to get your message out there, but it's not. Now, if you look at, say, like your Instagram, your LinkedIn, even your podcast, your YouTube channel, in my opinion, that is classed as owned media. So those are platforms that you own yourself. You can curate and create the content on those platforms. And there's a certain leverage and power to that, obviously. That's the reason why we have a podcast. There's something even more intangibly almost powerful, though, about when you get onto what I call an earned medium. So, for example, when you go and guest on somebody else's podcast, or you get into a news publication, or you get onto a news channel or a TV channel, or you get into a blog that you can become part of, or you get into a newspaper publication, there's real value to that because of the perception of you being an expert. Now, that third party author, I used to work in PR. It used to be my sort of day job.
Chloe from Clapham.
We've mentioned her on a podcast before, or Saucy Jenny from the Nando Sauces days. You might have to check a previous or a future episode to get the context of that conversation. Terrible listening experience this, but I'm glad that we're still doing it. But when I used to work in PR, there was what you call a PR multiplier. So in the days when I used to work in broadcast, there's a certain cost to getting onto the radio if you're going to pay to advertise on there. But PR, because it is editorial-led content, they reckon that it's between 3 and 8 times as valuable because of how valuable the mind of the consumer perceives that to be, because a third party effectively says, hey, you're brilliant for the thing that you're doing if someone else has you on their show or creates content around it. So the number one thing, though, when you're trying to secure PR is make it super easy for them and what's in it for them, right? So if you're going onto the radio, and this definitely used to be the rules back in the day, and I think it's still the rules now, they have to adhere to what's called Ofcom regulations, and there's a certain percentage of the content that needs to be regionally relevant. So if you're in the UK, for example, and there'll be the same sort of regulations around the world, but let's say, for example, if you are in Brighton, a certain amount of content on BBC Three Counties on the radio down there has to be Brighton or South Counties related, or else they won't have their Ofcom license. It's the same thing for commercial radio to a slightly lesser extent these days, but they will have to have something that is regionally regional variant that is of interest for their listeners or their consumers of their content. So make it easy for them. So if you're going to go and pitch things like local radio, which can be a great thing to do, by the way, then make sure you've got an angle as to why you're relevant for their show.
Yeah.
So obviously, if you launch a podcast, it does really well, and you're a Brighton resident, then you may need to make sure that when you send the email through to the editorial team, Brighton podcaster secures number one podcast. Like, that's the number one way to get them to actually want to take that content, because they, as I say, they have got to a vested interest and sometimes a regulatory need to make regionally variated content. Same with like newspapers, for example. Like there's less and less regional newspapers now, but they still need regional content. So if you can make it easy for them, that will make it a lot easier. Second thing I'd say is to have a look at a press release, and you can just like Google press release template and have a look at how those are structured. Now, you might not want to send it as a press release. That might feel a bit grandiose. You might want to send it in the format of like an email, but equally still write it like a press release, still write it in the format of a press release. So headline, subheadline, sentence, stat, how to get in contact, make it super easy for people. Because what's happening a lot in publications, if you read like The Guardian online or The Mail online, often a lot of them will now be saying, hey, support us, like donate. I think The Guardian's got a flipping donate button. I'm like, really? I'm donating to the press? Seems crazy, but there's so little money in the space now that people who are in those roles, the journalists or the contributors, they're having to do a lot more with a lot less. So if you can make their job easier, it can be a much more surefire way of getting content in there. I would say also look at things like awareness days. So for example, every month there is going to be an awareness day. It'll be Mental Health Awareness Day. It will be, there's stuff as serious as Mental Health Awareness Day. There will be, Asperger's Prevention Week or whatever it may be. But equally, then there's some fun and light-hearted stuff like there's British Barbecue Week or Flip Flop and Jelly Week. There's like these
when's that?
No, Flip Flop and Jelly Week is August, I imagine. But there'll be stuff like that. There's one I was about to say there's one that's really inappropriate. It's got steak in it, and there's another part of it, but it's really weird. But there's
mind is boggling.
But if you go into at the time of recording, if you say like 2025 awareness days, you'll find a bunch of these awareness days and awareness months. So again, you could create content or a reason and a rationale as to reach out to publications based on that. There's also contributing to articles. This is something that I think is really, really useful. So let's say, for example, and I think there's even more power in this than there is in sort of mainstream, quote unquote, media these days. So for example, I ended up getting what were they called? Business Insider. Reached out to me. They're massive online, huge publication. I think they've got like 7 million followers around the world. They get more hits than traditional press tenfold. Anyway, they reached out to me to get, and this was a couple of years ago, they reached out to me to give a quote about my thoughts on Harry and Meghan starting a podcast agency. Do you remember when Spotify done a deal with them?
To make their own podcast.
To do their own podcast.
Yes.
And then they started their own agency off the back of it. Anyway, so Business Insider, and I thought this was a blag, Business Insider phoned me and said, we're looking for a contribution. And I was like, right, about what? And they said about what the story was. Now, I thought it was one of these like, be in a Forbes article, whether you pay $1,500, which you could do, by the way, and is still...
People use that as a tactic.
People do use it as a tactic. They 100% do. And it's still a valuable thing because, again, perception is reality. Yeah. And if, being in Forbes is going to help you, then okay, fine. So anyway, I thought it was a pay-to-play thing. And I was like, I'm not really interested. So that's a shame because you came highly recommended. And I was like, right, who by? And someone in the newsroom at Business Insider had listened to my podcast, Building the Brand. And I was like, how mad? So anyway, so I did that. So it was like James Burtt, podcast expert James Burtt said blah, blah, blah. And then that piece got syndicated onto a couple of different other platforms, which then ended up with somebody at GB News seeing the article and getting me onto GB News. So I ended up getting Business Insider through Startups Magazine and my podcast, and then ended up getting onto GB News, which if you're not in the UK, that'll mean nothing to you, but effectively they're online publications or TV channels. And
tell us a bit about then what Harry and Meghan said.
And Harry was, I didn't appreciate your contribution. No, that's an awful Harry impression, isn't it?
Terrible.
I'm definitely not doing a Meghan impression for a myriad of reasons. But anyway, but that led on to getting loads of speaking opportunities, going to other people's podcasts. So again, to sort of reiterate, we won't make this one a lengthy one because I don't want to make it overly complicated.
No.
It is about making it easy for the person that you're going to reach out to. Make it specific as to why you want to feature in their publication, on their radio station, on their TV channel, and not because I want to get to more people. Like, what value can you give to their audience? So, for example, with GB News, if I wanted to go back on it again, I would go, hey, XYZ producer who put me in touch. I know that I came on and did the Michael Portillo show on Sunday morning around podcasting. I know obviously there's XYZ thing coming up, or the Joe Rogan phenomenon off the back of Donald Trump recently is going to be, it's very much in the news agenda. If you ever need someone to come on and contribute, please do let me know. Because from a credibility play, I can then go, hey, come on to my podcast, because I'm also featured in Business Insider, on GB News, on Virgin.com, and all these other associated different places. But I would also say, in terms of securing PR for your podcast specifically, probably one of the best forms of PR that you can do is being on other people's podcast. Correct. Now, if I do a piece on TV, if I do a piece on online press, if I do a piece in print press, again, if Evening Standard wants to include me in a publication, okay, very nice. But it's actually, like, how difficult is that from, other than a credibility perspective? It's probably not really that valuable. Online, they could click a link. They can't do that in a newspaper. But also from the scaling up of your own podcast, if someone's listening to a podcast already, they like the format and the medium, you can ask them to put a direct clickable call to action in the show notes or in the show description. I think it's far easier to kidnap that audience of the podcast that you're on and then move them over to your content. I did it recently. I was on a podcast with a guy called Spencer Lodge, who's got a big podcast out in Dubai. And straight away, I had 3 or 4 inquiries for agency services. I had loads of people started following me. And I'm actually thinking about it. We did a previous episode about the results we've got through this podcast. It's probably no coincidence that the UAE is one of the countries we featured as number 1, because we've got a newfound audience of people in that region. So don't discard PR. Don't discount PR. That earned media is super, super powerful. And if you get it done in the right way, if you can leverage it in the right way and leverage the appearances on the radio, on the TV, in print, even online publications, it's really, really super valuable for your brand new business.
We had a client, and they're a PR agency, and a few years ago now, and their goal, or their version of podcast success, was they wanted to get the number 1 podcast in the marketing chart in the UK. They got the number 1 podcast in the marketing chart in the UK. And interestingly, what they did with every episode, and it was a mixture of clients and people that they would like to work with. So they had, example again, Jamie and Ed from Candy Kittens. They were a client that they actually, who introduced me to those guys originally. They had other businesses like Huel that they wanted to work with, that they interviewed on their podcast. But what they did was they pitched a story within each episode to the mainstream press. And I remember seeing the Jamie Lang one, and it was, like Daily Mail, in the actual paper, in the Mail, online as well. And they said the amount of inbound inquiries they had for their services off the back of that podcast, which I think was it was like an 8-series episode we released for them, was phenomenal. It was like over and above what they expected to get. And again, recently, as another example, client that we work with who's just renewed to do season 3 in the new year, they sent me a deck that we send them a deck, like going through the stats like we just did in a previous episode. This is the results from the last series, giving them the downloads, the subscribers, the followers, yada yada yada. They came back and took that, made their own deck, and said, whilst we really pleased with the success of season 2 with the downloads and the streams, what's even more surprising and successful in our eyes is the fact that this is generated, and I can't remember the amount, but it's like a figure, like you say, it's like X amount of pounds worth of
PR
free
value.
press.
Yeah.
And they said that was the biggest thing that came off the back of the season 2 launch, was the amount of press coverage that they got from all the interviewees, the guests that were on that show. So podcast success, as we say many times, is different in the eye of the beholder, and it's defining what that is. And when it comes to generating PR and press for your podcast, you don't have to be a huge blue chip company to do that. You could literally be doing, as you saying, Googling, press templates, press release templates online, and literally putting the information into that, finding the journalists in your local press that's specific to that thing. Is it the business news? Is it the entertainment news? Making it specific, as you say, Brighton, Bournemouth, Basildon, whatever it is, and just doing it.
Yeah.
Trying it and seeing what results you get. And again, don't give up when you get the first one is nothing. You don't hear a reply back. Phone up and double check. This is what I've done. Phone up and make sure that they've actually received that and ask them what the chances of that going out. Because they're the press. Guess what? They're looking for press. They're looking for publicity. They're looking for stories. Just like you and every other podcaster out there is always looking for guests for their show.
Yeah.
Rant over.
And if you're in a B2B space and if you're in a super niche, there will be a newsletter. There will be a publication, like Farm Park Weekly. They will need stories all the time. And if you can do a good job of interviewing the sort of people that would resonate with their audience, potentially if you can say to them, look, we're doing this podcast every week anyway, we turn it into a blog. I'd love to create a story around this for you every week. Would that be of value? I think a lot of publications these days will bite your hand off, make it super simple for them, make it relevant for them and do the job for them. And then they're much more likely to feature you in that valuable press. Right. Hope that's been super useful. Ali, thank you for the question. If you would like to ask a question and get a shout out on the podcast, like Super Duper Ali, you can click the link in the show notes now and you can join Pod School. It is the free community for podcast makers who are looking to start, grow and monetize their podcast. We've got loads of cool stuff in there. We've got webinars, Q&As, hot seats, podcast audits, loads of stuff like that. If you are looking to take your podcast to the next level, take your content seriously, then that is the place for you. Thank you for listening. As always, please feel free to leave us a comment in YouTube if you're watching, leave us a rating review if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or any of the other podcast apps. And me and him, we'll see you on the next one. Ta-da.
Bye.